Hi everyone. I wanted to make a short video walking through how I make a ggplot figure. So we've talked a lot about setting up our basic ggplot call, how to define our aesthetics in the AES command, lots of different geomes that we can add to our plot, and how to add labels and customize our plot. But putting all of those together into making like a single nice figure is something that takes a little bit of practice. So I wanted to walk through how I make a ggplot figure and sort of build it up iteratively, and also how much I end up having to Google stuff because I forgot how to do things. So I hope this is useful as sort of an example of how I go through and make a ggplot figure and sort of what I'm thinking as I'm making it. So we're going to try to replicate this figure on the right here as much as possible. So this comes from The Economist, an article where the link is here. If you haven't read this article yet, you should pause and go read it quickly so that you know what we're working on here. So the first thing that I always do is, here I've made a new R Markdown document. And the first thing I want to do is save this and save it in the location where the data files are that we need to read in. So I've, in our lecture slides here, I've made a new directory that has the two data frames saved in it that we're going to use. And I'll call this something like econ walkthrough. Okay, so now it's saved, and it's saved in the same location as the two CSVs that we're going to read in. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is read in our two CSVs and save them. So I'll make a data frame called points.df, and I'm going to read in this points.csv file and save it as that object. So if I run that, I can see down here it ran without any errors. And now I want to make paths.df, and same thing, I'm reading in a CSV, so I use read.csv. And then this is GDP happiness paths.csv. So if I run that, that looks good. And then anytime I read in a data frame, the first thing I do is I take a look at what it looks like. So in RStudio, we can use view, and we can call view on our new object points.df. Okay, so it looks like we have 85 entries here, 16 columns. So we have country names, a country code, happiness score, GDP, population, and some other stuff here. Okay, so that looks good. Okay, so we're replicating this figure here, right? And so when we're making a ggplot, the two things we want to start with usually are what are on our axes here. And so if I look at the x-axis, you can see this is GDP per person in thousands of dollars. And then the y-axis is happiness on a 0 to 10 scale. If you read the article, there's some more details about where this data comes from. Okay, so let's start by making our first ggplot call. Right, so we always start with ggplot, and then we have to set what our data is. And here we're going to start with the points data frame. So points.df. Right. And so we have two things going on in this plot, right? We have some points, and then we also have lines. Right? So if we read the article and sort of look at this figure, we realize that these lines are showing a change over time. Right? So the line starts at the 2008 average, or 2005 to 2008 average, and ends at the 2015 to 2018 average. Right? So that's sort of what our line represents, and the point represents where it is in 2015 to 2018. So I'm just going to start with the points for now and then add in the lines in a bit. Okay, so we're working with the points df data frame. When we set our AES, we know we want GDP per person on the X and happiness on the Y. All right, so I'm going to go back to our data frame here and try to figure out what the column names are that correspond with each of these. So here, happy is probably this happiness scale, and GDP.PC is probably GDP per capita or GDP per person. Okay, so we want GDP per capita on the X, and the Y we want happy. Okay, and we've done this before, and we know if we just run this, it's going to make a blank figure with for us with our axes defined and the right range. Okay. But here we want points, right? So we're going to do geom point. Great. Okay, so this looks sort of roughly right. We have points and our axes defined. Okay, so the next thing that I see when I look at this is it looks like the points are sized by population in millions. So when I know that we want to change the size of our points based on some column that's in our data. All right, so I go back to points.df, like, okay, what is population? Probably this one, pop, will have the population. And I know that I want to change the size of our points based on population. So just format this to make it a little bit easier. So I want to add a new aesthetic, size equals pop. So if we do that, now we see that the size of the points corresponds to the population of the countries. Right? So I'm guessing this is India, this is China, this is the United States out here. Okay, so looking better, right? But I also see here that the points are colored by different things. Right? So right here it's telling us that the blue ones mean moving in the same direction, and red is moving in opposite directions. So from reading the article, we know moving in the same direction means as GDP increases, your happiness also increases. And moving in opposite directions would be your GDP increases, but your happiness declines. And in most cases, it looks like there are cases where moving in the same direction means you're getting richer and happier. But it looks like there's at least one example here, Venezuela, where it's getting poorer and less happy. Right? So again, this is moving in the right direction. Okay, so I need to set the color based on whether it's moving in the same direction or opposite directions. All right, so I go back to my data frame here and try to figure out what column that is. Okay, so I think that's going to be in this paradox column, right? So it's sort of about the paradox of income versus happiness. So I think true means that they're moving in opposite directions, and false means there's no paradox, they're moving in the right direction. Okay, so I know I want to set my color based on paradox. Let's see what that looks like. Okay, great. So we have colors now, but it looks like potentially the colors are backwards. So I'm pretty sure this is China, and it's red, and India is colored blue. Okay, so I want to manually change the colors so that they correspond with what the figure is. So this is something that I always have to look up. Right? I'm pretty sure I need scale color manual. So it's telling me I can set the values and breaks. So let me say values equals, right? And so we have two values, we need to set a vector of colors, and we set a vector with C. So let's say, let's set this first one to be blue and the second one to be red. Incomplete expression, right? Incomplete expression usually means I'm forgetting a parentheses. So I add one in, and now it runs. Okay, so the colors aren't exactly the same, but the blues match up with the blues and the reds match up with the reds. Okay, so that's a little bit better. Okay, so for this basic plot now, I noticed that some of the points are not transparent and some have some transparency. Right? And so we can remember that in ggplot we set transparency using the alpha aesthetic. So some of these need a full alpha, like fully opaque, and some of these are transparent. So we need to figure out what column to use to set alpha. So to do that, I go back to my data frame. And here, so I've modified the data frame a little bit and created a column called alpha that has two different values, 0.5 and 0.7. Right? So these are just set to be a higher number when it's one of these countries that we want to emphasize. Okay, so Now I know I want to set alpha, so set the transparency according to the column that's also called alpha. Let's run that. Okay, and that's what we expect. So certain countries are fully opaque and others have a little bit of transparency on them. So that looks good. Okay, so at this point we're getting pretty close on the points. Maybe at this point, once I have sort of a basic plot, I like to just clean up the labels a little bit, just to make it easier to figure out what's going on. So we can just basically match what the labels are here. So the title is GDP per person versus self-reported happiness. The subtitle is 85 countries. Right, and so here they're sort of following a convention of telling you at a high level what's going on with the title, and then the subtitle providing a little bit more detail about the data. Right, so it's telling us that they filtered out some countries, or the Gallup polling data might not cover all countries. So we're only looking at 85 here. Then on the x-axis, we have GDP per person. They're looking at log scale, and it's in thousands. We haven't done that yet, so I'm just going to leave it as GDP per person. And then y is happiness. And we can also put 0 to 10 scale. Okay, so if we run that looks a little bit better. Right? So titles, axis labels, looking a little bit better. It's created a bunch of legends for us here. I think we'll come back later and clean some of these up once the plot's a little bit more finalized. Okay, so I think this is. Oh, actually, let's add one other thing here, right? So these countries have labels on them, right, but not all countries are labeled. So if we go back to the points data frame, we see that there's a column called name that has all country names in it. And then there's another one, label, that only has some countries defined, right? And these are the countries that we're interested in looking at. It's the US, Venezuela, UK, and a few others. Great, so we want to add some text to label these points so we know which ones they are. And to do this, we can do something like geom text or geom label, and that will put the label exactly where the point is. But usually we don't want that because it gets cluttered and we end up overwriting our points. Our label ends up covering the point that we're interested in. So the way that I usually do them is to use the right. So I use this all the time and I forget what it is. So I want to use the ggRepel label function. Repel label point. And what is the geom called? Okay, geom text repel is the one that I want. Right, so even though I use this all the time, I still have to look up what arguments are, or what the different geoms are. So if you're doing that, you're doing the right thing. So I'm going to use the ggRepel library. Great, so I see down here, I always check to see if it loads without any errors. So it's installed, it loads just fine. And now I want to add geom text repel. So if I run that, it's going to give me an error. It says problem while setting up geom, error occurred in the second layer. Geom text repel requires the following missing aesthetics, label. Right? So I told it to draw some labels, but I didn't tell it what column the labels come from. Right? So when that happens, right, it's basically telling us in sort of kind of opaque ggplot language how to solve our problem. And it's telling us that we're missing a label aesthetic. So here we can say we need to define a label, right? And in our points data frame, label is in the same, the label we want to use is in a column that's also called label, which is convenient. So we say in our AES, label equals label. Let's run this. Okay, no error this time. and now we see that all of our points are labeled correctly. Okay, but then here we notice that all the countries have different sizes for their labels, which is probably not what we want. But this makes some sense, right? Because we've told it here, use population to change size, and we define an AES up here in our main ggplot call. It's going to use that aesthetic in every single layer that takes in a size argument. Right? So it's changing the points by size, which we want, but it's also changing the labels according to population, which we don't want. And so if we want to use an AES in just a single geom, we can take it out of our main AES call and put it just in the one that we want. So we want our points to be scaled, have their size scaled by population, but we don't want text to be sized by population. So we just put in a separate AES here, right, that says just for point, use population as the AES. So let's run that. Great. So now all these labels are the same size, but the points are still varying by population. So that looks a little bit better. Okay, so I think we're pretty set on the points now, right? So we have the points in the right place. We have some labels. There's some stuff with the axes that we haven't done yet. So this is in log scale, and here we're in non-log scale or untransformed space. But we can come back to that. All right, so now we want to add in these lines that represent how GDP and happiness have changed over time. Okay, so to do that, right, if we go back to our points data frame and sort by name, right, we can see that we only have one observation for each country. We only have their data in 2018 and not in a previous year. Right? So the lines represent a change across 2 different time periods, and so we know that this data frame is not going to help us with that. We only have where it ended up. So here's where we need to go back to this other data frame that we read in the paths df. So if we open that, we can type view paths df, or you can command click here, and we'll open it up too. Now we're looking at path df, and if we sort by name, we can see there are 2 observations for each country. Right? So we have their value in 2008 and their value in 2018. So this looks a little bit more promising for getting the path showing change over time. Okay, so we know we want to do a geom path, right? But we don't want to use our original data, this points df. Instead, we want to use our new data frame, the paths df. And just like we can override AES in each geom, we can also override data in each geom. So here we can say data equals path df. Okay, and let's just try running that. Oh, paths df. Oh, right, so if I just did path df, it was giving me this little underline and saying no symbol named path df in scope, right? Because I forgot the s. Right. It's also telling me the same thing over here. So paths df. So if I run that, I get something. So we have lines, which is good, but it looks like all of the points are connected to all of the other points. Right. So it's looking at this data frame. It's saying I need to draw some paths. I'm going to draw all the paths, and that's obviously not what we want here. Right. So what we really want is, like for India, we want to draw one line for India from where it starts to where it ends. But in the way that we've set this up, there's no conception of what points or what rows belong together. Right, so what we need to do is figure out a column that tells us which observations go together. Like these 2 go together, these 2 go together. Right, so it seems like this name column, right, that tells us what country it is going to tell us which 2 observations belong together. And we saw before that when we're doing line graphs, sort of a change over time line figure, a similar thing comes up. Right? So you might remember from that that the way that we tell ggplot what points belong together is by setting a group aesthetic. So this is telling us, right, there's a column in our data that tells us which points or which observations or rows belong to the same group. In this case, group is defined by country, and country is under this column called name. So we set group equals name and run it. Now we get one line segment for each country. Great, so this is looking a lot better. Okay, so we have lines now. The transparency is set. We have labels. We have points and lines. The sizes look good. It's looking a lot better here. Okay, but there's still some things to do. Probably the first big thing to do is our figure ends up looking a lot different from this one, because here they're using a log scale on the x, right? So a lot of times we like to log things like income or GDP because they're so right skewed. There's a small number of rich countries, or if we look at income within a country, a small number of very rich people. And so by logging it, we essentially compress our data and make things a little bit more comparable. Okay, so we know we want to change the x-axis to be scaled by a log. So we can do that with, so we're scaling, and specifically we want to scale x. And we could do scale x continuous, right? And it's telling me here that there are a bunch of arguments we can do. But there's also a shortcut, which is we can scale x by log 10. Right? So it's basically taking log base 10, essentially counting how many digits are in the income and plotting that on the x-axis. So if we do that, great. So now, instead of being really spread out, we're looking at GDP per capita of around 1,000, 10,000, 100,000. Yeah. Okay. So that's looking better. But these labels are still kind of ugly down here. So in this, right, we're plotting dollars here. We might want it to show up with a dollar sign. So we can say we want our labels to be determined by a function that comes from the scales library, and specifically label dollar. Right? Open close parentheses because it's a function, and then close. Let's see what that looks like. Okay, great. So now we have nice, very easy to interpret labels. We don't have to do like exponents in our head. Let's see, GDP per capita of 1,000, 10,000, 100,000. Okay, that's looking much better. The next thing I might try is, this is the default ggplot background, which has its proponents and its haters, but it doesn't look a lot like what we're trying to do here. So I might try just changing the theme to be something like theme minimal. Okay, all right, so that's looking better. So it's a white background. There are slightly fewer ticks. It's getting a little bit closer. Okay, so at this point, probably what I want to do is fix these legends a little bit. Okay, so the first one probably is alpha, right? So we're not really trying to show any, like the alpha values aren't really interpretable. We're just using alpha to emphasize some points and de-emphasize other points, right? So we don't even really need to tell people what alpha is. It's pretty clear from the plot. We're highlighting some points that we want to talk about and then showing the rest, but we're not labeling them or interpreting them. So we just don't really want this alpha legend at all. So this is one of those ones I have to think about, but I'm pretty sure we can do guides alpha equals false. Well, let me Google that quickly. Hide legend. You can tell I was Googling this earlier today. Hide legend for specific AES ggplot. So So we can say, let's scroll around here. Okay, looks like we can do plus guides. The AES we don't want, and then say none. Let's see. Well, let's see what happens if we do false. Okay, looks like if we do false, that works too. Right, so just to sort of show you before and after, if we just run it as is, we have a legend for alpha. We don't want a legend for alpha. So we can say guides alpha equals false. Okay, so that's going to get rid of alpha as our legend. Okay, so paradox, false, and true isn't super informative for us. So we might want to say something like blue means moving together and red means not moving together. Or here they say moving in the same direction. Right? As you get richer, you get happier. As you get poorer, you get less happy. Or red meaning that you get happier, or you get richer, but you get less happy, or vice versa. Okay, so here we set the color according to paradox. And so we probably want to do something where we change the scale. Oh, unexpected. Okay, scale, color, manual. Right? Although I realize actually up here, I already have that defined. So if I ran it again, it would mess it up. Okay, so we've here, right, in scale, color, manual, we've already added it because we want to control what colors to use. But now we want to change how this shows up in the legend. Okay, so I think we do something like labels. And blue means moving in the same direction, and then red is moving in opposite directions. Okay, right, close the C, and then we also have to close scale, color, manual. Let's see what that does. Okay, so that gave us an error. Oh, incomplete expression. Oh, incomplete expression. So that usually means we have a plus and then there's nothing after the plus, and ggplot says, I expected another thing and I didn't get it, so your expression is incomplete. Right. So I think what the problem is we are ending our plot with a plus. Let's delete that and see what happens. Okay, great. Okay, so instead of saying true and false, it's now showing us some descriptive text showing us, telling us exactly what the color means. So that's good. Okay, so another thing we might want to change here is pop and paradox aren't all that useful. Right? So we can set these to be a little bit more descriptive. Okay, and we can do that inside labs, right? So basically any aesthetic we define, we can add something to in labs. So we've set X and Y are aesthetics, and now we want to say the label that goes on size, right? Because here population is, size is set by population. We want to label that with population. Okay, so let's see what happens when we do that. Great, so it's now changed pop to population. And then here, right, so this is, the variable is called paradox, and so when it generates the legend automatically, it just calls it paradox. But we want to name it something like happiness and GDP per person. Right? So here, right, this is the legend for color. So we want to say set the title for color to happiness and GDP per person. Okay, so now we've labeled it like that. If we didn't want it to stick out quite as far, if we want this to be a shorter title, remember we can always tell ggplot to put in a new line. So \n is going to break it and put it on a new line there. Right. Okay, so instead of being one long line, it's now split onto 2 lines. Okay, looking better. the next thing we might want to change is to have population be something a little bit more readable. Okay, so we're setting, the size of the circle represents population. We want to change the way that size looks. So we probably want to say something like scale size. And it'd be nice to have something like, you know, the population in millions will have like 50 m instead of 50, 000, 000. So, right, that's something that I don't remember off the top of my head. So I'm going to say scale size ggplot millions. Okay, display an axis value in millions in ggplot. That looks right. Okay. It looks like we can use scales unit format. So in here, right, there's a scale layer that's added, and then the labels are set with unit format. We don't want to set Y with this, we want to set size, but it should work just to put this in. But let's see. So it's size labels equals scales unit format. Let's see what that does. Great. Okay, so looks a little bit better, right? But it's showing us the whole value, but it's adding m. Let's see if there's, we don't want to set them manually. Okay. Oh yeah. So we want to say like number SI. I don't think that's what we want. Right. So this is kind of the boring part of ggplot that we don't do in lecture, but is a lot of what I end up doing. Okay. Oh, okay. Here we go. Unit equals m, scale equals 1 e to the minus 6. Let's see what this does. Right. So basically, this is going to divide it by a million and then add m. Great. Okay. So it's divided it by a million and added an m. Sort of like the lowercase m. Okay, so much better. So it's easier to tell, okay, so a circle this big is 300 million, a circle this big is 900 million. Okay, so let's just take a look at where we are. Okay, so we're looking pretty good here. There are a few things we could change, like we could move the legends up here so they don't take quite as much space and they're a little bit easier to follow. And then we could start to change things like the axis labels, or so the axis grids. Right? So this one doesn't have any vertical grids, only horizontal grids. So let's do those two and then call it a day. Okay, so first up, let's move our legends up here. Right, so where legends go is part of the theme argument that we've talked about. Right, so we can modify the theme directly. And so here we've set sort of a base theme for the whole plot called theme minimal, but we can also sort of go in and tweak specific parts of that theme. And so we want to move the legend. So let's see if we type legend. So this starts to bring up some backgrounds. So legend justification isn't quite right. Legend dot position. Okay, it can be none left. Can this be top? Let's see what that does. Okay, great. So that moved our legend up here to the top. looks like. Big. Great. So our legend's now across the top, which matches our original thing a little bit closer. Okay. Great. And then the last thing I think to do is to make it match a little bit closer, we might want to remove these vertical lines here. So again, that's also in theme. I think this is something like grid dot axis dot it's not axis line. I thought it was something like grid. Okay, so this is when I turn to Google. Change grid lines. Okay, so panel, okay, panel.grid. I was searching just grid. So we want to change the Y grids. So let's say, let's copy this. And we want this to be blank. And we talked about how to do this. We can set things to element blank. So let's try that. Okay, so it's, did that change anything? Let's try minor. Oh, okay, so we got rid of the wrong ones. So we got rid of the horizontal lines, but we wanted to get rid of the vertical lines. So here, instead of Y, we want this to be X. Let's run that. Okay, great. Although they only have big lines, they don't have these intermediate ones. They don't have the minor ones. So we can also remove those. So we want to get rid of the minor grid lines on the Y-axis. Let's run that. Great. Okay, so we have the major lines on the Y-axis. We don't have the minor lines, and we don't have any lines on the X-axis. So that's looking pretty good. There are a few other things we could start to change. Like we could add these less happier annotations directly to the text, or down here. If we want to get really fancy, we could change the label of the text in our legend using the ggtext package. And then we could change the typefaces and fonts a little bit to make it look a little bit closer. But this is looking pretty close. So I think at this point we are probably feeling good, and we can call it a day.